And I want to thank Vista for the invitation to be part of the post-conference here. Thank you for sticking around. And again, I think a really solid turnout for the post-conference here this year, which I think reflects the program that you all put together. So thank you for that. Before I get started, I'm going to acknowledge Sarah LeCount. So Sarah's a PhD candidate in our lab. But Sarah's been working in this area. And again, I was asked to talk about the importance of fiber as a source of energy in the transition period. All right, so carbs, right? Of course, they comprise the majority of the diet dry matter in transition, just like they do in other parts of the lactation cycle, most important source of energy. Most of the carbohydrate research, though, that's been done in transition cows has largely been focused in two different areas. And the first area here is, where folks, like Drakely's group at Illinois, stuff that Sabina Mann has done here and lots of others, and it has really looked at varying, say, forage NDF and starch levels before calving, again, provided the basis for controlled energy diets, et cetera, and things like that fed during the prepartum period. On the other hand, other work has looked at on the post-calving side has also kind of looked more at also varying starch and digestible NDF, mainly through swapping out starch for non-forage fiber and things like that during the post-calving period. But comparatively little works really has been conducted directly on the impact of fiber digestibility in diets fed during both the pre-calving and post-calving periods. Okay? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to just hit three major topics here, or main topics, and then we'll go from there. First one I want to talk about is just kind of cover the research in which forage NDF has been replaced with non-forage fiber in transition diets. Okay, there have been a few studies out there. Again, not as many as you might think, but some work out there. Secondly, we'll talk a little about varying forage NDF digestibility during the transition period and what we know about that from a couple different studies that are out there. And then we'll wrap up and spend a little bit of time talking about transition cow performance and metabolism as affected by NDF pools, right? So we'll get into, again, the discussion that we've been having and others have been having relative to how you break NDF down a bit further. So again, we'll start with work where folks have looked at replacing forage NDF with non-forage fiber. This was a study done at University of Florida, and it was published back in 2001. Holcomb and co-authors had 46 Holstein cows entering second grade lactation. Basically fed them one of two diets for either ad libitum or restricted intake beginning at least 28 days before expected calving. So it was a 2x2 factorial arrangement. Had high forage versus low forage, and then then they fed these cows again for ad libitum intake versus restricted intake. And restricted was basically set to 8.2 kilos of dry matter per day. So that's 18 or so pounds per day or thereabouts of dry matter across all treatments. Okay, I'm not really going to talk about the ad lib versus restricted comparison. I'm going to focus on the forage comparison within the ad libitum group. And of course, like in many transition studies, all cows fed the same diet after calving. Look here at the diets. I'll highlight this because I'm sure you can't see it in the back. The high forage, low forage. Basically, what they did is they decreased Bermuda grass hay. They fairly dramatically decreased corn silage. They brought in hominy. It's the increased hominy, and they brought in soybean hulls at about 28% of the diet dry matter. So they really jacked up the non-forage component there and really reduced, of course, the forage component through the Bermuda grass hay and the corn silage. Okay. In terms of just some specs on diets, NDF in the high forage diet was 44, was 39 in the low forage diet. Starch was 22 in the high forage, 25 in the low forage. So there was a little bit of play between the treatments relative to those types of fractions or whatever, but clearly, fairly different diets. Okay. So what they found here is that cows fed the low forage or the high non-forage fiber, high byproduct diet versus the high forage diet for ad libitum intake. Okay, so we're only focused on those treatments or within the ad libitum intake group. They had higher pre-calving intake, so about 14 versus 11 kilos. So that's 6-7 pounds of dry matter intake, right? So that's a pretty meaningful or pretty large difference there. It had lower overall plasma NEFA levels, and again, this was across the entire pre and post calving period, and higher overall insulin concentrations. But interestingly, No difference in postpartum intake. So despite a fairly large difference in prepartum intake, no difference in postpartum dry matter intake. They basically were, essentially within about a pound of each other. And actually also no difference in postpartum milk yield. And again, you may not be able to see this, but basically 30 kgs versus 37, and it was low, numerically lower in cows fed the low forage diet that had the higher prepartum intake, right? So again, no trend or indication anyway of a positive postpartum outcome there relative to productivity anyway. All right, do some work here from Minor. This again, Heather Dan was the lead author on this. Published in 2007. Had Holstein cows and heifers, so animals entering first lactation. 2 treatments beginning 21 days before expected calving, a high forage diet or dry cow diet, and then partially replacing that forage with the forage component with non-forage fiber. And basically they brought beet pulp in. So essentially, they, as I'll show you, they reduced forage content of the diet, brought in beet pulp as a non-forage fiber source, and again, a similar theme, all cows fed the same diet after calving. All right, their diets here basically had corn silage here at about 35% of the dry matter across both the control and the beet pulp diets. They basically, essentially, had about 30% oat hay as a percent of dry matter of the control, cut that in half, and then essentially replace half of the oat hay with beet pulp. Right, so fairly straightforward design for a practical design relative to something that should have increased certainly digestible fiber or through the beet pulp in that study. Left the rest of the diet the same. Again, some numbers here: NDF content 42 in the control, 40.5 in the beet pulp diet. Starches 18.9, 18.3. Sugars 6.5, 6.5, 6.4. So very similar, at least chemical composition in that way in this particular study. If you look here, essentially they found a whole lot of nothing, which is what happens sometimes, right? But looking at prepartum dry matter intake, high forage, basically the same across the 2 diets. Okay, about 11 kilos in both cases. No difference here in blood NEFAs pre-calving. No difference in blood ketone. Well, actually, you could argue a trend here maybe for actually a little bit higher serum BHBA in the beet pulp, and that may be butyrate to beta-hydroxybutyrate in the rumen wall as opposed to necessarily liver-based BHBA. That's just speculation. Post-calving, 1 to 14 days in milk. No difference in intake, no difference in milk, no difference in NEFAs, no difference in blood ketones, right? So again, that change pre-calving, right, not necessarily translating into post-calving types of effects. I think the last one here I'll show you, this was work done at Penn State in Gabby Varga's group and published here in 2008. Holstein cows entering second or greater lactation, 4 treatments, again in a 2x2 factorial arrangement. They had what they call a conventional dry cow diet versus a high non-forage fiber diet fed for basically the full 60-day dry period. And then they looked at 0 versus 330 milligrams of monensin per day by top dress for the last 28 days before calving. So, the diets themselves for the full dry period, okay, monensin for the last 28 days or so. And then, again, all cows fed the same diet after calving. All right, again, apologize for the size here, but I'll highlight here for you. So basically what they did here, you have conventional diet here, the non-forage fiber. They dropped the corn silage. They had corn silage in the conventional, about 45% of dry matter. They moved that down to about 35% of dry matter, brought in about 7% of dry matter as alfalfa hay. They dropped out the grass hay. This was a study they brought cottonseed hulls in, right? So they brought cottonseed hulls into the diet. Of course, cottonseed hulls contain I guess a whole lot of not much, right? But anyways, brought them at about 15% of the diet. They did increase soy hulls, right? So there was some additional digestible NDF they would have gotten there, and then made some fairly modest adjustments to the rest of the diet. Nothing too huge here, although I was interested to see that they did pop the RUP down a little bit in the non-forage fiber source diet, probably to maintain some level of or close to isonitrogenous. I'm not really sure, but I do wonder a little bit about MP differences in these treatments, okay, or these diets. NDF contents about 47 and 44, NFC 28 and 30. So, fairly similar, in terms of those types of composition, but definitely different diets. All right, so cows fed the non-forage fiber diet had higher prepartum intake, so about 16 versus 12 kilos. That's 9 pounds of dry matter intake, right? So pretty large differences here in dry matter intake. Pre-calving, did see a little bit lower NEFA concentrations before calving, had higher prepartum plasma glucose or insulin concentrations after calving. So, I see stuff like that, and what do you think I think? I think, hey, that ought to translate into something after calving. Ought to be off to the races there. Interestingly, no difference in postpartum intake, about 21.8 versus 21.3. No difference in postpartum milk yield. A slight numerical advantage in favor of the high prepartum non-forage fiber, but you see a p-value that's not even close to something you'd really probably even discuss. No difference in blood NEFAs, and tended to have higher postpartum BHBAs, right? Again, not a major difference there, but again, so fairly large difference here in prepartum intake, not necessarily translating into what you might want to see post-calving. So I'm going to switch gears and talk a little about varying forage NDF digestibility during transition. And the way I'm going to do that is I'm going to highlight 2 studies. And both of these studies actually are the 2 studies in the literature where BMR corn silage, the BM3, replaced conventional corn silage both before and after calving. Okay, so this was the work done and published a number of years ago by Bill Stone. And just to remind you of that, what Bill did is, again, done at Cornell, it was 3 weeks pre-fresh, and basically for the first 3 weeks or so after calving, just had conventional corn silage hybrids versus BMR, or brown midrib. And then between weeks 3 and 4, they changed everybody went back onto a conventional corn silage-based diet. Okay, so the BMR was applied only during that prepartum and postpartum period, roughly 3 weeks on either side. The diet formulation goal was to keep all parameters the same, except for NDF digestibility. Diets are formulated as CPM dairy. Remember that, Charlie? So just a few moons ago, right? But again, use CPM at the time. Okay. Just I'm going to quickly review some of the analyses here. This was the 2005 crop year corn silage. You see the trial was conducted in 06 to 07. You see conventional BMR. This is the forage analysis for each of these. About 30% dry matter, so a little bit on the wetter side. About 44 to 45% NDF. You see the decreased lignin here with the BMR. Slightly lower starch, slightly lower in vitro starch digestibility, but a big increase here in 30-hour NDF digestibility, right? So kind of what you might expect, especially relative to the fiber digestibility. Okay. Again, Bill put these diets together really looking to be very similar between the conventional and BMR, with the exception of fiber digestibility. I'm not going to go through these other than just give you the sense that corn silage in both cases pre-calving comprised the majority here or not the majority, but almost half the diet dry matter was corn silage, was with a little bit of haylage and some wheat straw, et cetera, and some fairly minor adjustments beyond that. Around 44% NDF in both cases, 17 to 18% starch in both cases, et cetera. So nothing too remarkable from my standpoint there. Fresh cow diets are both around 40% of dry matter as the conventional BMR, and you see haylage and a small amount of wheat straw in there, and then kind of concentrate from there. All right. Okay, and again, I'll go back here. NDF's 32-ish. For both treatments, and about 22 to 23% starch. So again, nothing too unusual there in terms of thinking about at least what some fresh cow diets might look like. All right, so in this case here, they did see differences on both sides of calving, and this is the graph of dry matter intake. Let's see if I can go back here. The graph of dry matter intake, you see the BMR is here in the line on top. Okay, if you look at the numbers here, dry matter intake from 14 days before calving to calving, picked up a little bit more than a kilo of dry matter intake, so between 2 and 2.5 pounds of dry matter intake advantage for the cows fed the BMR. But, importantly, right, and more importantly, I would say, picked up 2 kilos of dry matter intake between days 0 to 21, right? So you're looking 4 to 5 pounds dry matter intake increase here in the postpartum period. Now, they would have gone back onto the same diet right around here, and so you do see the lines come back together there, right, to some extent, but clearly you see the differences there after calving, okay? But again, it's about the milk, right? Or at least, well, it's about the health too, right? But it's about the milk. And in this case anyway, you see cows fed the BMR. They produced more milk not only during the first 3 to 4 weeks after calving, but that milk yield increase or difference persisted out through the end of the trial at about 15 weeks, or I think 105 days or so post-calving. And so weeks 1 to 3 basically had about a 3 kilo advantage in milk yield, a little bit more than that. But weeks 4 to 15, again, everybody's on the same diet then, still maintained about a 2 kilo difference in milk yield, right? So again, seeing improved forage NDF or fiber or forage NDF digestibility, translating into productive outcomes from there. And then the next one I'm going to highlight is some of Sarah's work here. So this is she talked about it last year here at Cornell Nutrition Conference, and then had an abstract, and she actually had a poster on it out in the hallway that a bunch of you saw. And so this was done. Mike Van Amberg was really kind of the lead on this study, and I was here on the tail end. So again, cows, 85 cows entering secondary grade lactation, 4 treatments in a 2x2, conventional versus BMR, corn silage-based diets, again, mycogen BM3, beginning 21 days before calving, expecting calving through 42 days after calving, and then either no rumensin or monensin at 330 milligrams per day prepartum as a target, and 450 postpartum, right? Your actual proceedings paper has an error in it. I had 500 in there, but it was actually 450, okay? Sarah corrected me. So NDFs here, prepartum control BMR. This is diet or diet nutrient profile. So about 41% NDF, 29 to 30% NDF. Postpartum starches between 17 and 18. Around 27 or so, 27 to 28 here postpartum. Again, similar between the 2 treatments. UNDF here, this actually predicted using CNCPS. This was not although she had the forage values to go in there and things like that, so she was able to get there. So about 15% of dry matter is UNDF 240, and then about 13, and then 10.4 and 7.8. So some differences there likely. And then MP in terms of grams per kg of dry matter was pretty similar, maybe a slight edge here to the BMRs. Okay. Again, looking here at some of the intake data and milk yield data in these cows, I'm going to focus mostly here on the corn silage comparison. In this case, did see an increase here in prepartum dry matter intake. It wasn't huge, was a little bit under 2 pounds. And again, in this case, we did not see any intake advantage here postpartum with the BMR. But Sarah did see milk yield, right? Got about almost 3 kilos, 2.5 kilos here of milk, and those cows fed the BMR for the first 42 days after calving. So again, they were BMR on both sides of calving. And kind of going along with that, looking here at NEFAs, prepartum NEFAs, lower NEFAs for cows fed the BMR. BHBAs were not different. Post-calving NEFAs were lower for cows fed the BMR. BHBAs, blood ketones, were lower for cows fed the BMR, et cetera. So, more production, better metabolic status, right? So clearly in that case, improved forage fiber digestibility translating into outcomes that we want to see. Okay. All right. So last thing we're going to do is talk about the NDF pools. How much time do I have? Plenty of time. Okay. And don't say that to me. All right. So, okay. Although I didn't know until yesterday Mike Van Amberg could give a 30-minute talk. That was outstanding. He was even done less than 30 minutes. It was amazing. So, all right. Sorry, that wasn't fair, right? So, okay. So I'm going to go back and show you a couple things that we've done before, and this is actually out of Maris McCarthy. Maris is here in the room, I think, somewhere. Maris did her PhD in our program, and now works in the tech side of Adiseo here in the Northeast. And so she had done some work in her PhD program relative to feeding different starch levels post-calving, and had some rumensin in there. And we ended up having kind of a train wreck at the start of one of our studies, ended up restarting the study. But whenever you always try to learn something out of this stuff. And so basically what we had is we have a bit of this, I'll call this a case study. We do want to get this published in some way, shape, or form beyond the CNC proceedings, although I guess what's better than that anyway, right? But anyways, sorry, this is just an aside. Okay, so fully searchable online, no problem. So I'm going to walk you through this. This is the before, these first two columns, and the after, okay? And so the first two columns, this would be high starch, low fiber, low starch, low fiber, high starch, high fiber, low starch, high fiber. So basically low fiber, high fiber, and basically the difference is we dropped the BMR and we increased wheat straw, right? And some of you remember us talking through this one before. You know, basically the BMR and also the haylage that we ended up feeding were significantly lower in fiber than what we'd used to formulate. So basically we were shorting these cows on fiber, okay? And so we fixed it by bringing probably a boatload of straw, you know, into the diet, probably more than we probably needed to, but we were kind of in a you got to fix this kind of deal, okay? And so, you know, because again, you look at this on a 40-pound intake package, that's 4 pounds of wheat straw, right, in a fresh cow diet, which makes most nutritionists start to kind of sweat or twitch or something like that. But if you look at the NDFs here, before 26.4, 31.5, afterwards we were in the mid-30s. Starches, you know, 28. So that combination of 28 or 26 NDF and 28 starch was definitely a killer from a health standpoint, as you'll see. You know, a little bit more modest here with the lower starch, 22, 32. Again, a fair amount of non-forage fiber in these lower starch grain mixes. Again, we're used a variety of sources there. And then, you know, 34, 26 starch, 21.5 starch, you know, et cetera. 30-hour DNDF as a percentage of NDF, percent of dry matters are here, right? So we did see some differences here, especially with in this diet here with a higher byproduct in terms of percent of dry matter as 30-hour DNDF. And then again, trying to be in the cool kids club here. The UNDF 240, you know, this is by wet chemistry here. You know, about 8 and about 9, and then between 10 and 11 and 10 and 11, right? And again, these numbers do vary, you know, again, these are wet chemistry from the lab, and again, I'm not sure our models have everything fully seeded in them and things like that. So so the numbers you may see in your models may be slightly different than that, because especially if they're not accounting for the byproduct or the non-forage components there of the diets, okay? All right, so our results here, and again, not fair to make these comparisons because these are not contemporaneous treatments per se. Again, this is kind of before and after. But what you see here in terms of, you see lots of either forage effects or starch by forage or starch by fiber interactions here. And it's interesting to kind of look down here, and kind of the two kind of best performing treatments were kind of the low starch, low fiber, and the high starch, high fiber, kind of almost you could argue the bookends here. But in terms of intakes, you see the UNDF 240 intakes here. Of course, they're quite a bit higher here and probably more in the range where mine would be comfortable with them here for cows fed the higher fiber. You know, but the milk side here, we definitely lost milk or definitely had lower milk yields in these cows fed the high starch, low fiber. And even you could argue maybe a little less milk there in the low starch, high fiber type diet, and better in the intermediate. The NEFAs again they didn't certainly look very good in this high starch, low fiber. Again, the low intake, lower milk, higher NEFA, higher ketones. Haptoglobin here, so you know, haptoglobin concentrations are an acute phase marker indicator of inflammation, right? So higher in these lower fiber cows than the higher fiber, so that would be supportive of maybe some ruminal inflammation or ruminal type issues leading to systemic inflammation. And then again, the health stuff was what we've talked about before and was pronounced. 4 out of 7 cows with DAs on this treatment. It was awesome. 2 out of 10 on this one, and then, you know, basically on these two, no cows out of 77 with DAs, right? So just and you know, very little other stuff going on, right? Okay. And again, this is what caught our attention. This is the graph of the intake here, again, from Maris's paper in 2015. This is the line here for those cows fed that low fiber but high starch type diet that was pretty deadly. In the middle here, both kind of those almost, you could argue the bookend, well, the low starch, high fiber, the high starch, low starch. I should look at my damn lines, right? Okay. The low starch, high fiber, and then the high starch, high fiber was the best. Okay, high starch, high fiber was the best. Okay, but again, made us curious about the kind of the combination of those two, right? Essentially, you get lost in your own stuff. Okay, so that led Sarah, and again, I apologize for the side here too, to really want to hit this or try to look at this in a more controlled way. So we had, so she formulated two post-calving diets here, kind of a low fiber and high fiber. In this case, we used conventional corn silage, which probably may have limited our chances of response. We were BMR and the other. The thing that actually kind of in hindsight's always 20/20. We had this alfalfa hay that we used instead of haylage that turned out to be, it was from Kansas, turned out to be 50% UNDF as a percentage of the NDF. So this stuff was half sticks, right? Or whatever. And so as a result of that, we ended up actually overshooting some of our targets here for where we really wanted to be, right? We wanted to be a little lower on the UNDF, especially on this low fiber type diet. But anyways, okay, starches here around 25% or so, et cetera. Okay, if you look here, basically we have a good example that when you overshoot your targets here, and again, back to here real quick, we again took straw basically from the big change here was dropping down conventional corn silage and bringing up some wheat straw here. So 1% of diet dry matter up to about 9% of diet dry matter. So again, we put a good stroke of wheat straw in that diet. So what we learned, right, is that when you do that and you probably overshoot that target, okay, you can limit your dry matter intake, right? Okay, and again, these diets we fed for 4 weeks, Sarah, 28 days. Okay, all right. UNDF intakes were higher there. Milk yield itself was not different, and actually it was interesting. Once they came back onto the same diet, they pretty much came back together pretty fast. Rumination, interestingly enough, despite quite different diets, exactly the same, basically exactly the same. So 540 minutes for each of the two treatments. Okay, looking here at blood NEFAs. Okay, high fiber had higher NEFAs, had higher ketones, had lower glucose, and poor energy balance. Right. So again, back to be careful not to overshoot this thing. Right. I do think that putting a little more. Again, whether it's UNDF, I don't know if Rick Grant's still here or not, but his PUNDF or whatever he's coming up with, right? In there, I think has some advantage to a point, and that's and your set point there is going to vary certainly depending upon what the rest of the digestibility of that forage looks like in that particular year, right? I mean, in 2017 corn silage, right, with poor digestibility, you weren't going to be cranking a whole lot of other fiber, necessarily at least indigestible fiber into those post-calving diets for sure. So just to summarize here, hopefully I'm okay on time. I guess if I'm not, then it's just the way it is. But replacement of forage NDF with non-forage fiber generally increases prepartum intake, but again, interestingly, doesn't seem to translate into meaningful postpartum responses. Right, so available research, again, fairly limited, but does suggest an increasing forage NDF digestibility does result in higher intake after calving, better milk yield, improved metabolic status. Okay, and so it certainly seems like, and I think it sort of explains why when we have poor forage digestibility, we can throw non-forage fiber into diets and things like that, and usually make things a bit better. But we're never really fully. It seems like we're never really fully satisfied by that. We can never really quite get where we might have been otherwise. So there's something about, I think, specific about forage NDF digestibility in this time frame that's important. I do think that Increased NDF digestibility needs to be accompanied by sufficient UNDF intake to facilitate that rumen adaptation. Again, I think if we that is, there's certainly enough evidence relative to, and Greg Penner's group and others relative to postpartum, acidosis and things like that these cows can get into. But I obviously think we got to, more research needed, right? To continue to kind of refine these recommendations or pools during that immediate postpartum period. So. Again, with that, there's my email, and again, there's Sarah's email, and thank you for inviting me and for the attention. So, okay.
Thank you very much, Tom. Any questions to Tom? We still have time.
Has anybody looked at low-lignin alfalfa?
Question is, I'll repeat the question. The question is, has anybody looked at low-lignin alfalfa? I am not aware of if somebody else is aware, please. I have not seen a study in transition cows with low lignin alfalfa. I'm sure that there's either been some done that may not have been published yet, or still, somewhere in the works of the pipeline. Right? Anybody aware of a study with low lignin alfalfa in transition cows? No. Okay. Sniffin's our watchdog over here, so he says no. So odds are, if Charlie's not aware of it, it's probably not there. So, okay. But I think that's again, back to the notion. I mean, it would make sense. It'd be a logical, obviously another logical thing to look at. Yep. All right.
All right. Thank you, Tom.
Back to you.
Please help me thank Tom.
Thanks.